Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this lecture on everyday peace indicators. My name is Ethan Pate. I am an event coordinator for the Security Distillery, a student-led think tank associated with the University of Glasgow's IMSIS program. Today, I have the unique pleasure of introducing Dr. Pamina Firchow. Dr. Pamina Firchow is a celebrated researcher and practitioner, being the principal investigator and CEO of the NGO Everyday Peace Indicators, as well as an associate professor in the Conflict Resolution and Coexistence program with the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University. Quick notes about the structure of today's lecture. Dr. Firchow will be giving a talk on the subject of EPIs for the first portion of the lecture, followed by a Q&A section. If you have any questions throughout the lecture, please put them in the chat box and we will do our best to address them during the Q&A portion. Additionally, I would like to ask everyone remains muted for the length of the lecture and the Q&A unless you've been asked otherwise. Finally, this session is being recorded, and said recording and corresponding summary document will be uploaded to the Security Distillery's website in the coming week. With all that out of the way, Dr. Firchow, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ethan, and thank you for having me. I'm going to share my screen with my PowerPoint here. So, as Ethan said, I am an associate professor at the Heller School at Brandeis University, which you see behind me here. Not really, but at least in Zoom form. And I also co-created the Everyday Peace Indicators methodology and run the Everyday Peace Indicators NGO. And so, let's see here. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a mix of a presentation of my book, Reclaiming Everyday Peace. So in that presentation, I'll give a brief overview of the book and explain the methodology of the Everyday Peace Indicators. Essentially, I'm going to be using the book to illustrate how EPI can be operationalized. And then I'll give a brief presentation of current and ongoing projects associated with EPI. And then obviously we'll go to questions and discussion. So the book that I'm going to be presenting is Reclaiming Everyday Peace, Local Voices in Measurement and Evaluation After War, which came out in 2018 with Cambridge University Press, and this year came out in Spanish translation. The book also won the Conflict Research Society Book of the Year Award this year, and I gave a presentation of the book, and I wanted to share it in the chat. I'm gonna have to stop. I can never figure out how to share chat or put something in the chat and then share the screen at the same time. But here is the video and the description of that talk, which is a lengthier talk on the book. Today, in order to be able to fit in both a talk on the book as well as on the projects, I'm going to give a rather brief I'm going to give an overview of the book, but I'm going to give a pretty brief overview of the findings. I'm not going to go into detail about the findings. So if you want to go into more detail, I mean, obviously you can read the book, but you can also watch the other video. So, all right. So to begin with the book, the book deals with microdynamics of peace. And we have seen a study of the microdynamics of civil war since the mid-2000s. In particular, political scientists have been studying these microdynamics of civil wars and violence. And that has really become an interest to peace researchers, an area of interest to peace researchers in particular. There has been less of a focus on the microdynamics of peace and also the microprocesses of peace in conflict-affected contexts. And this is where I see my work in this book filling important lacunae in order to understand better local conceptualizations of peace and community agency in peace-building processes. So essentially what I'm looking at is how do locals conceptualize peace and what are their priorities in doing so, and how does that help us evaluate peace building? And in the book, I look at two main questions. First, are local level peace building efforts after war and mass violence effective? And if not, what's missing? And second, how do we most effectively measure effectiveness of peace building at a local level? And I answer these questions using the Everyday Peace Indicators methodology in a matched case research design of villages in Uganda and Colombia. And I'll go get into more detail on that in a moment. So in order to answer these questions, it's important to also clarify what I mean and what we all mean by peace building, because it's so easy to talk past one another with such a vague concept that can mean so many different things. And so in the book, I distinguish between small p and big P peace building efforts. That helps shed the light on the different kinds of international efforts and their interactions with locals, and to offer conceptual clarification surrounding the concept of peace building. So big P peace building, as I call it, refers to large-scale interventions that include everything from sustainable development assistance to global health and infrastructure. Typically, we see international organizations like the UN and the World Bank use the term peace building in this way. And we also see political scientists who are empirically studying peace building use or understand peace building in this way. In contrast, small p peace building refers to more localized and relationship-oriented efforts to build peace at the community level. These efforts include exercises related to dialogue, memorialization, and reconciliation processes, as well as other efforts to strengthen the social fabric of communities. So when local and international civil society organizations dedicated to peace building to building peace refer to peace building efforts, this is usually the kind of peace building they're talking about. So as I said, conceptual clarification is important, because without understanding succinctly what is meant by the term peace building, we are unable to determine the boundaries between what is included and what is excluded, and what exactly it is that we're trying to determine is effective or not effective. So just a brief summary of the book and the findings of the book. The results of the study I present in the book illustrate that small p interventions are fundamental to building peace in contexts that have received a significant number of big P interventions. In other words, conflict-affected localities that have received interventions from multiple international actors are more likely to require assistance in building community ties and social cohesion, and to prioritize these things than those that have received little or no peace-building assistance at all. In contexts where there have been big P peace-building interventions alone, societies were not likely to be any more peaceful according to their own community-generated indicators of peace than those with few or no interventions. But I'm going to show you how I got to these conclusions first. So measuring the microdynamics of peace is no easy task. Unlike the microdynamics of a civil war, there are no concrete events to measure, like battle deaths, injuries, or rebel group movements. And what to measure can become highly subjective, and decisions about what is important and therefore measured are often made by outsiders and experts rather than insiders and locals who are living the concept, the peace we're trying to measure. Therefore, I present and operationalize this methodology called Everyday Peace Indicators that I co-created with my colleague, Professor Roger McGinty from Durham University. EPI is based on the premise that local community members are those who are best placed to identify changes in their circumstances, rather than relying on external experts to identify indicators for them. It is also based on the premise that peace, and as well as conflict, security, development, reconciliation, etc., is experienced, embodied at the local level. So in bringing together localized experiences and measurement, EPI attempts to build bridges between epistemological and methodological divisions in the social sciences. The challenges with top-down processes of indicator generation and quantitative measurement is reflected in the debates between interpretivists and positivists. So this is where interpretivists are generally more concerned with capturing all attributes of a concept, as well as being concerned with the relativity of concepts. Whereas positivists are more concerned with what is measurable, generalizable, and identified as belonging in the conceptual data container. So obviously, these contrasts are somewhat of a caricature. And I realize that there are a lot of overlaps and gray between these approaches, not to mention the tensions in mixed methods approaches. But generally speaking, these are some of the main methodological tensions that exist between scholars working from positivist and interpretivist standpoints and represent the potential bridges that EPI can build. So now I'm going to provide a very short overview of the everyday indicator process. I can talk about the steps and the details of the method, like for example, sample selection or participant selection in the Q&A. But before I begin, it's important to remember that the everyday peace indicators process is a process where we are conducting systematic research and data collection to produce what's called participatory numbers, or numbers that are generated from the bottom up using rapid rural appraisal techniques and participatory action research at the very local level. So we're working at the village or the neighborhood level. And there are 4 steps involved in the EPI process, and I'm going to go over those, as I said, very briefly. So we start with focus groups. And in the focus groups, we have representatives of the community, so the locality, the village, or neighborhood. And typically we conduct 3 focus groups, one with men, one with women, and one with youth. Of course, in some areas, it's not possible to conduct focus group with youth, so we split the focus groups with to girls and boys. And in those focus groups, we begin really quite slowly by just talking about peace and people's conceptualizations of peace in their communities. And then we begin to probe further and ask questions more specifically around what are the signs that you look to in your daily life to determine whether you are more or less at peace in your community? What are the tangible things that you look to determine whether you are more or less at peace? And then we go through what we call a verification and voting process. Once those focus groups are finished, we usually transfer the indicators that were generated in the focus groups to lists, and then the indicators are then presented to the community in these verification and voting sessions, where we essentially, it's a discussion about the indicators that were generated in the focus groups. Oftentimes this is the aha moment for community members because they finally see what we're trying to get at with these initial conversations, and they then are able to give us more detail or tell us more about what specifically they meant with an indicator that was mentioned in the focus groups. And so in those lists, we have a time period in which we discuss the list, and then we do a voting process where we give community members a certain number of votes, and they then use those votes to vote for their top indicators of peace in their community. In this study for this book, we gave community members 10 votes. In others, we've done 20. In others, we've done 15. Most recently, we've settled on 15. It seems about the right number. We typically, with 15, end up with around 40 indicators per community. In this study, it was a bit less. Okay. So at this point, you probably want to know, what do these indicators look like? And you can see that the individual indicators here can be analyzed on their own to say specific things about how people conceptualize peace in their locality, or to address community concerns. And we can really see how localized and diverse they are, representing multiple dimensions of peace and using local terminology, like, for example, the Boda Boda cyclists, which is a taxi driver, right, on a motorcycle in northern Uganda. And you can see how diverse and multidimensional they are. These are just some examples of the many indicators that came out of the communities in the study from this book. So, of course, as I was saying, these individualized indicators can say a lot and can also be analyzed to tell a narrative of the situation in a community. But of course, sometimes we sort of lose sight of the forest for the trees. And so the next step in the Everyday Peace Indicators process is a coding process where we take the indicators and we code them into code books using code books. And the code books we create inductively. This is an example of a code book. There are some other code books that are available on our website. And typically we have around 20 categories, and then we have subcategories that we also code the indicators into. And by coding the indicators into categories, we're then able to see trends. And we're also able to compare across communities. Because of course, each community in this kind of bottom-up process is going to have its own set of indicators. And that then results in the difficulty of being able to compare across communities and say things, from one to the next. But by coding them, using these code books and these categories, and again, when I said inductive, I meant essentially the code books are different depending on the location and the project that we're working on, because we create the code books looking at the indicators and looking at the salient categories that emerge from the indicators. And then we create the categories and the subcategories. And we have teams coding the indicators. We typically try to have someone from that context be part of that team, as well as someone foreign, so that there's a combination of interpretation of the indicators, and that we are approaching the coding process in as unbiased way as possible. And this then lets us be able to analyze the indicators in a more macro way and in a more comparative approach. Okay, so once we have gone through the focus groups, we've gone through the verification, we've gone through the voting, and the voting has resulted in 20 to 40, sometimes 60, depending, indicators per community, and then we've gone through the coding process. We have the surveys, and the surveys are essentially like any other survey, using indicators, also the traditional indicators that are usually created by experts. We use the everyday indicators as the basis of the questions that we then use in the surveys to be able to track change longitudinally over time. So really, one of the interesting things about this approach and about this methodology is that we can analyze the indicators themselves. We can say something about how communities conceptualize peace or a peace-related concept, a social concept like reconciliation, for example, depending on what concept we're working on with the community. We can say how communities conceptualize that concept comparatively. And then we can also populate surveys with those indicators to then analyze the survey results and be able to understand how perceptions change over time, and how those survey, and we can really quantify by using survey results of the communities, right? And so you can see it's really a mixed method approach where you have both qualitative data and quantitative data working in one methodology, one approach. Oops. So in addition, so back to the book, in addition to the focus groups in the EPI process, for the book I conducted over 100 in-depth interviews and collected longitudinal survey data over 3 years for a total of 2,038 surveys. And just a caveat here, you know, I mean, EPI provides really an opportunity for researchers to come into communities and do a systematic process of understanding their ways of conceptualizing these difficult to define concepts. But of course, at the end of the day, a study is going to always be of higher quality when we spend more time and know better these communities, in particular when we're looking at perceptions and when we're looking at difficult to define concepts like peace, peace building, reconciliation. When we understand communities better, that is when we can begin to really say more with certainty about our results. And so, so even though it's possible to come into a community and do this process within a week or two, the quality of the work is always going to be higher when we spend more time with the community. And so that's also why I spent a good deal of time for this book, and also complemented the research with in-depth interviews. I chose the countries because of similar tactics that were chosen by combatants and state engagement with locals. Both contexts had high levels of suspicion and collaboration and denunciation between civilians and armed combatants and state actors. Sorry, I've just, I'm getting ahead of myself here. And I also chose the communities or the countries because massacres in the villages happened around the same time period, as did the peace-building interventions. So the study was conducted in 2 matched case villages. The data was collected from 2013 to 2016. And the matched case villages, each in 2 matched case villages, each in Uganda and each in Colombia. Both had the same matching criteria, which I'll briefly go over now using the example of the Colombian villages in the interest of time. Essentially, the process was the same in Uganda, but I'm going to demonstrate the process the selection process for Colombia. So as you can see here, these are the 2 villages in Colombia. And the villages in each country, also in Uganda, had as similar as possible demographics, histories of violence and displacement, religious and ethnic composition, but vastly different levels of external intervention after the violent events. And villages were matched for their similarities in everything but the amount of intervention, with the goal of matching villages that had little to no intervention with villages that received enormous amounts of external interventions, resulting in their reputation among the international community as laboratories for peace. So you can see here that in this example, in the case of Don Gabriel in Colombia, there were really minimal interventions. Mainly, these were reconstruction efforts by the government and some minimal assistance from the United Nations to construct the road that you can see in front of you there. But for the most part, there was really a minimal amount of external intervention. However, in El Salado, which is our laboratory of peace, you can see that there have been more than 120 external actors implementing hundreds of projects deemed as the laboratory of peace. And really pretty much if you, if you are Colombian, you've heard of El Salado. And oftentimes people have a question like, why did El Salado get so many interventions when Don Gabriel didn't? Well, I mean, good question. But one of the reasons was because this organization called Fundación Semana targeted or was interested in El Salado and began a massive campaign to raise money to reconstruct El Salado and also to bring back displaced inhabitants of El Salado that had been displaced because of the war. And so this hand there I have there, the bracelets are an emblematic sign of El Salado, and for a while everyone in Colombia was wearing the bracelets. And then Fundación Semana continued to have a presence in El Salado until, I want to say maybe 4 years ago. I mean, relatively recently. And was really a contact point for all these other organizations to begin to do other kinds of projects. And so it really became seen as this emblematic sign of what of how peace-building interventions in Colombia could be focused. And it was in a sense, a laboratory, because it was a possibility of where different actors could, different actors who weren't quite yet so familiar with what peace building meant and how to build peace in Colombia could kind of try out different kinds of projects. So now, as I said, I'm going to very briefly go over the findings. So my findings from these matched case studies show that in Uganda and Colombia, the localities with high levels of interventions particularly prioritized social issues such as community cohesion, interdependence, and conflict resolution over security and development when they identified their everyday peace. So again, focusing on peace indicators. This is important because efforts at attending to social cohesion and social psychological factors were at least attended to by, were least attended to by external actors. And there was clear external priority given to governance and security reform, job creation, or livelihoods and infrastructure. And of course, these are important elements of assisting communities after war, but they also can bring with them unintended consequences that, if left unattended, can have counterintuitive consequences, which I'll get to in a moment. So with little attention paid to relationship building and reconciliation efforts in communities with otherwise high levels of intervention, my findings suggest that there is no overall substantively higher level of peacefulness according to community-generated indicators of everyday peace than those with little or no intervention at all. The results suggest that there are disparities between what localities need after war and the interventions external actors prioritize in their local peacebuilding and reconstruction efforts. I also found that although communities with higher levels of intervention reported increased levels of development, they also reported higher levels of perceived insecurity. This means that conflict-affected communities with large amounts of what I call big P peacebuilding assistance or assistance in reconstruction and development require more interventions pertaining to social cohesion and community social relations than those with little to no assistance. Infrastructure, security, and development projects are usually prioritized over relationship building, and actors often end up substituting the building of a road for a real engagement with the root causes of conflict. In fact, these localities are much more in need of the kinds of relationship building efforts that can be supported by the international peacebuilding community than those that have had to rely on their own efforts or resources in reconstructing their communities after war. And this means that without a significant investment in the social dimensions of peacebuilding work, such as dialogue, conflict resolution, memorialization, and trauma healing, broader peacebuilding interventions such as reconstruction efforts and governance or security reform will not be effective at establishing sustainable peace over time. In addition, although the localities in this study prioritize social cohesion related indicators when defining everyday peace, overall people chose indicators that fell into multiple categories, as you saw in the individual indicators, representing both positive and negative peace and demonstrating the multidimensionality of peace. And this is relevant for measurement, since the majority of top-down attempts at measuring peace use indicators that focus primarily on violence reduction, and they therefore may miss important elements of what comprises the actual building of peace after war. So in conclusion, the findings of my study in this book have major implications for how we measure peace conceptually, as well as how we measure peacebuilding effectiveness on a project level. It demonstrates the importance of including localities in the generation of statistics and numbers, and not just treating people as data sources. And it stresses the critical importance of the social dimensions of peacebuilding interventions, which are often forgotten or sidelined in the rush to reconstruct or stabilize. The everyday peace indicators and the wider field of participatory numbers has incredible potential to help us advocate on behalf of marginalized people where their needs and priorities may get lost in an increasingly quantitative world that prioritizes numbers for policy change and guidance. And there's evidence that peacebuilding actors and researchers are realizing the potential of EPI as a tool to help move the field in a more nuanced direction, and a more bottom-up direction. We have now worked in villages and neighborhoods in 11 countries worldwide with a wide range of partners from US government agencies, the UN, and civil society groups. Although all of our projects have a research dimension, many are also applied, in particular for monitoring and evaluation or local planning and programming purposes. And we're, as I've been mentioning throughout the presentation, also working on other concepts apart from peace, such as reconciliation or justice, or you can see down here the concepts that we've been measuring. Excuse me, also resilience, for example, coexistence, reconciliation, violent extremism. And so I'm now going to give you a brief overview of some of these projects, not all of them. And so to begin with, we've been working a lot, especially recently, to develop further projects in Colombia. And what the biggest project that we have that is currently ongoing is the Everyday Justice Project, which I'm going to go over in a moment. And a smaller project that we have is a project on the scalability of the indicators. So I'm just going to quickly explain that one. That's the one here on the right, where we have a working paper, a couple working papers. I'm working with Allard Duursma from ETH Zurich and Naomi Levy from the University of Santa Clara. They're both more statisticians, at least than I am. And in this project, what we're really looking at is is it possible to create a bottom-up barometer? Or is it possible to scale the indicators to essentially say something about a larger territory? When I give this presentation or similar presentations to international organizations or to political scientists, often the response is, great, really interesting, but what can you say about a bigger territory? And so that's really the origin of this project, is to look at, okay, we can say a lot about smaller communities, villages. We can compare the results across villages, but what are we able to somehow scale these indicators to say something about a larger territory? And so we're testing this with an indigenous group in the Nariño and Putumayo provinces of Colombia. And the Pasto indigenous group was looking at and interested in developing a bottom-up barometer of sorts when the 2016 peace accord was passed in Colombia. And they were concerned about outsiders coming in and saying things about their peacefulness. And so it was really a great opportunity for both of us having the interest of looking at, can we scale this up, and them having this interest of seeing whether it's possible to build a bottom-up barometer for themselves. And so this project looks at essentially building models off of indicators that are collected in most different areas within the reservations of the Pasto indigenous group. I can talk more about that in the Q&A if you're interested. So going back to the Everyday Justice Project, which is here on the left, that's a project that I'm working on with Dr. Peter Dixon, my colleague, also at Brandeis. And this project is a significantly larger project where we're transitional justice and post-peace accord. How do you say them in English? The reintegration centers of ex-combatants. We're talking about the restorative justice mechanism, the HEP here, the Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz, which is this restorative justice mechanism in Colombia. We're talking about reparations. We're talking about development projects, basically everything surrounding that peace accord. And what we're looking at is the local reception of these mechanisms in 3 departments, in communities, in 3 departments in Colombia. We've started in Antioquia. We're going to move to Cauca, and the 3rd department we have not yet identified. And we're working in 8 communities in each of these departments. And so apologies, this is partially in Spanish, but I didn't have time to translate. So as you can see here on the left, you've got justice, development, reparation, reincorporation, truth, right? So the different kinds of mechanisms, and what we're looking at is what is the impact locally on the perception of justice and perception of coexistence in these villages, in different departments in Colombia. And so the research design, and this is again in Spanish, apologies, but basically you get the sense that municipalities, the way that we've done this, so this is an example from Antioquia, is there is a municipality that where the HEP, the restorative justice mechanism, is functioning. We've taken one municipality, which is Dabeiba, which is the municipality that has presence of the HEP, and then another one, Urao, that has no HEP. And then we're looking at, and you can see here to the far right, all the different treatments of different kinds of mechanisms. So you have Truth Commission, you have reintegration villages, you have reparations, you have these special development projects that have come out of the Peace Accord, and then you have controls. And obviously we wanted to do this more in the HEP treatment communities than the no HEP treatment municipalities. And so therefore have just reparations and control in the no HEP to be able to see if there's any difference. Right, imagine. Okay, and if you see here on the right, on the far right again, it says CEV, that's Truth Commission, and EPI. And so one of the challenges when you're trying to do project work in a context that's dynamic and that's in a peace process is you might partner with organizations that have certain intentions at the beginning. And then those, I mean, you know, politics influence the peace process, changes happen, budgets get cut, etc. So one of the challenges with the Truth Commission work was that it just didn't reach locally enough for our research. And so what we decided, and we got funding from Humanity United, which is a private donor, US-based donor, to do was to utilize EPI, because EPI is really an extractive methodology. And I mean, just like any research is, right? We're going into these communities and we're working with them and we're extracting these indicators. And sometimes we give them something in exchange, especially if we're working with a donor who's a partner. But oftentimes it's just research. And to some extent, there's a lot of potential for using EPI to also give back to the community. And so we had done a pilot of using Photo Voice, which is a participatory photography methodology. We actually did it in the communities in Colombia where I did the study for my book after the book was finished, and we were able to see that this was really a complementary methodology to the everyday peace indicators. So we decided to work with the Truth Commission to integrate Photo Voice and dialogue as the Truth Commission interventions in the treatment communities that we're working in Antioquia, and potentially also Cauca and the third department, or at least that was the idea before COVID. We'll see how that progresses. But and so that we're able to do our research, work with the communities to create these bottom-up indicators, but then also to give the community members a chance to visualize those indicators and really provide the community a forum for dialogue and discussion about the indicators. And then also be able to bring this to other communities, to be able to do a kind of a live comparison, right? You know, how do your indicators differ? Or bringing it, for example, eventually to Bogota will be interesting to demonstrate what local indicators look like for these communities far away in different parts of Colombia. So, so that's been a very interesting part of this project. And if you want to know more about that, I can send you more links. And there's also a Political Violence at a Glance article that we recently wrote with the whole Columbia team about the research. And then there's also some pictures from that photo voice project that we've started. What time is it? How much time? Where am I at? Ethan, you're muted.
We're coming up at the 45-minute mark, so
okay.
We can, if this is a natural stopping point for you, we can definitely stop and go to.
Sure. Let me just show you briefly. There are, I can eventually, if you're interested, also talk a bit about Afghanistan and our work there. Hold on. And then there's a project in Sri Lanka that I can also talk about that I had prepared. But I'm happy to end here and see if there are questions up until now, and then we can see, you know, if anybody wants to hear more about the other projects.